Okay. Hello everyone. This is the second lecture, and it's the second lecture that you will need for your asynchronous activity. And for this lecture, we will be looking at the aspect of setting. Okay, and when we talk about setting, there are two elements that we need to pay attention to. It's the element of time and the element of space. Okay, now what is setting? That's a very good question. No? Setting represents that aspect of the narrative which provides context for the action of the readers. So in a story, the characters will have to act at some time and some place. Okay? And setting can be analyzed in terms of time or in terms of space. Now, time and space give the narrative or the story a sense of reality. Okay, it gives you a sense of it feels like it's real, no, because of the play of time. Let me just check. I'm not sure if am I recording. Okay, it's recording. Okay, so time and space gives the story that sense of reality. Okay. Now, it is important to analyze time, even though in many cases when we read stories, it is not usually something that we pay attention to. And that's normally what we pay attention to are the characters rather than the time and space. And it's really because time is unobtrusive in the narrative and it exists only to provide structure and background to the narrative. However, if you pay attention to time and how it is used in narratives, it can definitely provide significant insights to the interpretation of the text. Okay, if you remember when we were doing structuring, you would have noticed that the structure of the narrative is often determined by the treatment of time. No, if you divide the narrative into episodes, you will notice that those episodes alternate between one, which passes very slowly, and then in another episode, it seems to pass very, very quickly. No, a very good example of this would be the narrative of Judges 19, which I assume you would have read now, including the paper that I asked you to read. No, in that particular story, if you look at the first few verses of the story, the time is very quick. No, the sense of time is very quick. So it simply just gives you some summary. No, they had the Levite and the woman had an argument. So the concubine goes to her father. The Levite pursues her there, and then when he gets there, you can sense that the time element seems to slow down because you see the episode showing you that they're eating and drinking, and then the father would try to convince the Levite to stay longer, so he would stay longer, and then they would eat and drink again. Okay, so time seems to slow down. So you in the stories, you have this mix of episodes where the time element is different, and sometimes you structure them. You identify the episodes because of the length of time that is contained in there. No, so that's one way to determine where the episode begins and end by taking note of the time. Now, the importance of certain incidents or persons in the narrative can be ascertained through the duration in which that person or event is treated in the story. Okay, so the general rule is when the narrator conveys an event or talks about a character or portrays the character lengthily or slowly, the general rule is that part is considered significant. Okay, so that's the general rule. So if there is a lengthening of time and a lengthening of the information that you get, the time element by which the characters are allowed to participate in the story, or the events are told such that time is slower and longer, usually what is contained there would be considered as significant. And a very good example of this would be the um, the case of Omri in 1 Kings 16:23 to 28. If you look at the text here, the story of Omri only takes up about 5 to 6 verses, verse 23 to 28. And it's very formulaic. If you've noticed the book of Kings, it's full of formula. No? It tells you the king when he took office or when he took up his kingship, how long he took, how long he stayed as king. No, so that's verse 23. And then it tells you about, sometimes it gives you details about who they are related to and things like that. So those are formulas. And then it tells you a little bit more about them. Now, in the case of Omri, it's only 20, for one verse, verse 24. It says there, he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria after Shemer, the name of the former owner of the hill. After that one verse, it goes back again to those very basic formulas in the book of Kings, no? Omri did evil, and then he was gone. He followed in the footstep of this king, so and so king. The Yahweh became angry, no? And then verse 27, as for the events of Omri's reign, what he did and so, are they not written in the book of annals of the kings of Israel? So these are very formulaic. The significant part of the story is just one verse. Now, contrast this with extra biblical literature, meaning literature outside the Hebrew Bible that was current during that time, and which gives you information about Omri. If you look at extra biblical literature, given the narrative time that is given to him, no, the literature ascribed to him, he is obviously a very significant king. Because, well, it mentions in extra biblical literature that he really built Samaria. No, not just bought it, but he really was very a key person in terms of the building of Samaria and how it eventually became the center of one of the important centers in Israel. So in extra biblical literature, it gives more details about that, no, the achievements of Omri. Now in the book of Kings, his reign is only reported in a few verses, with only one verse as significant. The rest are formulaic. And that might not capture our attention so much, no, especially if you don't know extra biblical literature, you're not aware of them. But if you contrast this particular story of Omri, you contrast that with the story of Ahab, which really takes up 4 chapters in the book of Kings, you will notice the difference, no? In the case of Ahab, it gives us more details about what he did, no? Maybe not the complete detail, but at least it gives us a sense of what he did, the things that he did wrong. Okay. So in terms of narrative time, obviously, Omri is more significant outside of the Hebrew Bible versus Ahab, who is whose stories take up more space and narrative time within the Hebrew Bible. And the reason for that really is to go back to what is the concern here of the Deuteronomies. The Deuteronomies is the editor of this material. No, I keep talking about the Deuteronomies, the Chronicler. So these are the bigger corpuses where these materials fit in. And we will be looking at that later on because it's important to situate these smaller stories within those bigger stories. Okay? Now, if you look at the concern of the Deuteronomistic material, the concern really is to give a theological explanation for the failure of the kings. No, how in this particular story of Ahab, how he turned away from the ways of the Lord. No, and the reason for spending so much narrative time on that is very significant from the perspective of the overall agenda of the Deuteronomies. No, it's theological in nature. Okay, it's not a book that talks about achievements only. No, the concern really is the failure, no, where Israel failed and how the kings contributed to that failure. So you can see that more spaces are given to those who uh, failed more, no, who sinned more, at least from the perspective of the Hebrew authors. So in terms of the treatment of time, Omri was given lesser time in the Hebrew Bible, in this particular section of the Hebrew Bible, compared with Ahab. So the general rule is, if there's more narrative time, if there's slowing down of time, if the narrator takes time to give you more information on the events or the characters, then treat them as significant. However, there are exceptions to this. No, it's not always the case that if it's very brief, that is that it's not as significant. I'm not saying it's insignificant. No, it's not as significant. There are exceptions. And one of the a very good example of the exception is the report of David and Absalom's reaction to the violation of Tamar, which, if you look at the story, it's very, very brief. No, after all that has happened, the report is very brief. Okay, but when you look at the latter part of the story, it will tell you then that even if the report was very brief, it was in fact very significant. So although there's a general rule, the final arbiter of the decisions, the exegetical decisions that you will make, would still be the larger literary context. No? So you situate it within the larger literary context. And if you do that in the case of this portion of David and Absalom, no, the report of their reactions, if you look at it later on in the subsequent literary context, you will realize that it's brief, but it's very, very important. No? It would not um, explain. It helped explain, no, what will happen later in the story. Okay. So the treatment of time fulfills certain functions for the reader. One of the things it can do is to create suspense. No, it's one of the major things that it actually does. It can create suspense or determine attitudes. Okay, so the lengthening of the scene or incidents can lead to the rising of the tension. Okay, remember that plot line that you have to draw, or it can create suspense as well. So for example, the narrative of Samson, and Delilah would be divided into 4 episodes, but it's really the fourth episode which is very much lengthened, no, in terms of narrative time. And this fourth episode is the one that creates suspense. So there are 4 episodes, particularly in Judges 16, no? You can divide it into 4 episodes, but it's the fourth one where there is more suspense because of the element of time, no? Especially if you really analyze the narrative. Okay, now in the case of the report of Absalom's death, you will notice that the report on his death is delayed. No, it's delayed, especially the report to David. So if you look at the narrative, by the time he died, you as the reader knows this already. Remember our lecture on point of view last time, that sometimes as a reader you are given more perspective than the characters themselves. So the reader is already given knowledge about the death of Absalom, but his father, the King David, doesn't know it yet. No, and that delay, no, that delay, the time delay in the report is really what gives off that it's what exaggerates that feeling, not exaggerates, it uh, it emphasizes more the desolation of David. No, it creates more impact because of the delay of the telling of the report. No, so I want you to revisit that to see how the time element there really creates more emotion in terms of how David will feel towards the news of the death of his son. Okay? Now, when you are looking at the time element of the narrative, there are 2 aspects that you have to take note of. No? And this is based on Gerard Genet. I think that's how it's pronounced. He is a scholar in literature and he's worked on narratives for a long time. And he talks about discourse time versus story time. Okay, so discourse time is the time taken to narrate the events. So this is basically the order of narration. No, first episode, second episode, third episode. Versus the story time, which refers to real time of the events. And when I say real time, I'm not referring to real world time like our time, but the real time, the logical arrangement of the events in the story. Okay? So, and they're not the same. The discourse time is how it's told. The logical arrangement, if you were to really arrange it, remember sometimes there are flashbacks, sometimes you are brought to the future, and then that's your discourse time. The logical arrangement is if you follow the actual logic of the story, no, in terms of the time element. And perhaps a good analogy here is that of a movie. No, in a movie, very often the way it is told is sometimes not linear. There are flashbacks. So it goes back and forth in terms of time. That is discourse time, how it is narrated. Okay? For example, in Filipino telenovela, we are we like flashbacks so much. I've just recently watched Hometown Cha Cha Cha. It's very interesting. Well, very relaxing. I'm very stressed. So I want to watch things where I don't need to exercise my brain so much, use my brain so much. I just want to, have fun and laugh at what I'm watching. Maybe when I maybe when I have more energy to spare, it would not have been a K-drama that I would want to watch. No? But I did enjoy a Hometown Cha Cha Cha. And in that story, the first episode, exactly the first, is you already see the two main characters in the as grown-ups. No? So they're already grown-ups. But every now and then, it will do a flashback of them as children, no? Just to show you that these characters know each other even before, no? And those flashbacks will give you a sense that they're really fated to be together. Okay, that's the use of the flashback. Now, this order of retelling is your discourse time. So you start with when they are already adult. Next is there's a flashback. Next is it goes back to when they are adult again, and then it goes back to flashback. No, that's discourse time. The order of episodes as they come. The story time is the actual logical arrangements of real-time events. No, in real story, if you were to account for the real story is that they started out when they were children. They knew each other. They met each other several times. No, there were several flashbacks. One when they were very like children, no, like preschool kids, and then another flashback when they were in high school, no, and they met again. So you'll have to logically order it that way because that's the story time. No? That's how it really happened within the story. Okay, so I hope that that gives you a better perception of what discourse time and story time is. So in terms of summary, story time is the order in which events are conceived to have occurred by the implied author in creating the world of the story. So this is the chronology of actual events, not chronology of the episodes as they are told. No? So the actual events in the story. And you sometimes you have to rearrange it because it's not told the way it's told is not chronological. No, that's your discourse. So for story time, you're talking about time here from an objective sense. No, it's continuous. It flows evenly without interruptions, and it's irreversible because that's the real continuity of the story. Versus discourse time, which is the order in which the events are described for the readers by the narrator or the order of the narration. No, and this is the literary time within the narrative, meaning it's also subjective because it doesn't follow the real chronology. So it's not uniform or regular, and obviously it will move backward and forward. And sometimes in the Hebrew narratives, there are stories that does this more more than others. Okay? And because this is the literary time, it is of course subject to gaps, delays, and jumps, no, as we have noticed already in some of the narratives that we have encountered. Okay? Now, in analyzing time, we therefore have to look at the relationship of these two elements, the discourse time and the story time. Okay? And when you analyze this relationship, you it will give you some handle in terms of discerning um, the focal point of the narrative. Okay? Because it gives you a sense of which ones are more important compared to others. Okay? And analysis can be done in two ways. So you either analyze, well, not either, no, but you analyze the sequence or order of events. That's the first one. And you analyze the duration or the length. So the order and the duration or length of the events. Okay. Now, the first one, um, when you are analyzing time, is anachrony. So this is where the discrepancy between the order of the events, this is the discrepancy between the order of events in the story versus the discourse time. Okay? And there are two kinds of anachronies, no? The first one is analepsis, where an event is narrated belatedly. I think we will be looking at one example. Is it just one? Yeah, one. Okay. I want you to, since this is recorded, you can go back to the other passages and have a check. Okay. So this is analepsis is where there's a flashback. Okay. And Judges 11, 1 to 3 would be a very good example. In Judges 11, 1 to 3, okay, it says here, now Jephthah, the Gileadite, the son of a prostitute, was a mighty warrior. Gilead was the father of Jephthah. Gilead's wife also bore him a son, and when his wife's son grew up, they drove Jephthah away, saying to him, "You shall not inherit anything in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Outlaws collected around Jephthah and went raiding with him. Now, if you just look at this part, it looks like it is part of a logical arrangement of the story. But if you look back a little bit, so this is the start of the chapter. It's verses 1 to 3 of chapter 11. If you look back a few verses ahead of that, you will realize that this is actually a flashback. No, if you look at chapter 10, verses 17 to 18, in verses 17, it says there, then the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead, and the Israelites came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. The commander of the people of Gilead said to one another, "Who will begin the fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over the inhabitants of Gilead." So they're looking for somebody to lead them. Okay? And then it goes to a flashback about Jephthah. So they're looking the actual setting is that they're looking for somebody to lead them in war. Okay? And then it gives you a flashback of this Jephthah who is the son of the prostitute. And then after verse 3, in verse 4 of chapter 11, the narrative resumes again, no? It goes back to the war scenario. Okay? Verse 4, after a time the Ammonites made war against Israel. Okay, so it's really the flashback is just to introduce a character that will become very, very important later on in the story. Okay, and there are different functions of flashback. If you look at this part here, no, I'm going back and forth with my slides. So this is my discourse time, going back and forth to the slides. The first one is to explain the actions or utterances of people or the origin of their situation. This is very similar to the introduction of Jephthah. Okay. The second function is to recount what has happened beforehand to the other characters that have bearing on the situation. Okay. And then the third one is to provide contrast between the character's present position and his previous ones. No? So it's really just to give you more information, whether it's to give you a background of somebody who will become very relevant later on, or to provide a comparison between the state of a character with his previous state, okay, or to give you a background of what happened before, why are they now in this story. So those are the functions of flashback. Okay, now the second one, the second anachrony, is what we call a prolepsis. And here, an event is narrated prematurely. So earlier on, it was a flashback. This one, you will really, you will be given some information about the future. So these are your predictions and forecasts, or sometimes we call them anticipation in the narrative. Okay. And now, when this is done by the narrator, this is not very frequent in biblical narrative. No, it's not very often that when prolepsis is done by the narrator themselves, this doesn't happen very often. Okay, and you can look at the example here in terms of the exceptions. Now let's look at an example. Here it's 1 Samuel 2 verses 2 to 25. Okay, so here, verse 25, if one person sins against another, someone can intercede for the sinner with the Lord. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can make intercession? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to kill them. Now, if you look at the last sentence, it was the will of the father to kill them. It really expresses, although the verb sounds like it's in the past, no, it really expresses a future intention. Okay, so it's moving ahead of time, just to give you an idea of what's going to happen later on. No? So this is your prolepsis. It looks forward, or it anticipates. Now, in most cases of anticipation, it is not the narrator. Remember I said if it's the narrator that does it, it's very infrequent. It is not the narrator, but one of the characters, okay, maybe the prophet, the angel of the Lord, who reports what is about to occur. Okay, so this is where you have your prophecy and fulfillment scheme. Okay, and examples here would be 1 Kings 17:1 and Judges 13, and I hope you can spend time to look at those examples. No, and the function here is to interpret the event in advance so that the listener will perceive the significance of the following event. No, by moving ahead of time, it gives you a little bit more information that will allow the listener to make sense of what is happening um, in the current time. Okay, so for example, Elijah talks about a drought that is to come. No, and that telling of that future event really is related to what is going on now. Okay, or the angel of the Lord's announcement of a birth, no, like in the case of Manoah and his wife, or that announcement of Isaac's birth, for example. Okay, that Isaac will be born later on. No, it's something that's going to happen in the future, but it's the telling of it, uh, the 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 advance narration of that future event has significance to the now, no, of the story. Okay. Now, the amount of time used in reporting an event, which we call discourse time, may diverge, okay, from the amount of time. Remember, there are two elements, the discourse time versus the story time. The amount of time that is used in narrating the events may diverge from the amount of time that is assumed to have transpired in the actual story during the event's occurrences, which is story time. So the discourse time in terms of length may be different from the story time. And analyzing this duration will help engaging the speed of the narrative, where it speeds up and where it slows down. So we will have to look at the relationship of these two. And here is the summary of the relationship. Okay, let me see. I hope the arrows look clear. Okay. So in a summary, so there are two major kinds of retelling. You have summary, you have a scene, you have a pause, and you have an ellipsis or a gap. Okay, and I'm showing this to show the relationship, so you can visualize it. Remember that discourse time is how a story is narrated, and story time is the chronology of actual events in the story. Now let's look at the first one. In summary, the discourse time, remember what I said about discourse time? How a story is narrated. So how a story is narrated is shorter than the story time. Okay, because it establishes connection between incidents. It gives a sense of continuity. It communicates information about development without taking too much time. Okay, meaning the story time may have taken longer, but the discourse time, the amount of time it's being given in how it is being told in the story is so much shorter. Okay. So in summary, if you look at summary, well, I gave this already. It establishes connection between incidents, gives a sense of continuity, and it communicates information about the development without giving you a lot of information. So a very good example is the one in Genesis 31:23. No, it's just one verse, but it's talking about what happened in 7 days. 7 days is relatively long time. No, but it takes you only one verse to tell you that. So the discourse time is shorter. Another example is Genesis 29:20. What you are covering there in terms of the story time is worth 7 years. But the discourse time is only given, one verse. Okay? So another example of this is Judges 13. I will not go to I will not look at the specific passages anymore. I will leave it to you to go and have a visit. In Judges 13, 24 to 25, this is the start of the Samson story. It gives a summary of the birth, the childhood, and the growing up years of the boy Samson. And the next chapter that opens up, he's already grown up. You know that a lot of things could have happened there, in between. But so the story time is longer, but you are given a shorter discourse time. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, when for scene, okay, the discourse time and the story time are roughly equivalent. No, the logical arrangement of the story would be almost the same in terms of length as how it is told in the story. Okay, so and this makes sense because in a scene, these are usually your dialogues, these are your conversations, these are the blow by blow account. Okay, so for example, a very good example of this would be the conversation between Amnon and Tamar, wherein if you look at it, it is told as if it's like an eyewitness account. So it really gives you the details. So the way it gives you the details, the discourse time is very, very detailed. So it takes time to give you that. Versus the story time, which is almost actually the same because it's really giving you exactly what happened, what the character said, what happened next, and so on and so forth. And that's a scene. Okay, so a scene presents a specific event occurring at a defined time and place. And this creates the impression that events are unfolding before the reader's eyes. You can really feel like you are part of what is happening there. No? So these are your These are your conversations. You are allowed to hear them. You are allowed to see what happens next, what is in the room, no? Who are the characters that are there. Okay, so these are your dialogues or conversation. Now, the next one is what we would call a pause, wherein um, the story time stops while the discourse time continues. No? The story time stops. This is normally when you are given descriptions or additional information or explanation. The story time stops because you are just given additional information. No events are happening, no? So here the discourse time goes on. You're still being given information by the narrator, or well, yeah, it's usually the narrator that's speaking here, but the story time actually um, is pausing, no? So here the narrator takes time to describe or explain something to the reader, and then later on takes up the story again. No, in a sense, the Jephthah example earlier is something like this, no? So in if you follow the story from chapter 10, you are given a preview of the war and how they're deciding who to they're looking for a person who's going to lead them. And then there's a flashback, and you are being given an information about a man named Jephthah. So the story stops there because you're just being given information. And then when it resumes in chapter 4, so there's a pause there, and then it resumes in chapter 4. Okay? So very good examples of this would be editorial comments, descriptions, explanations, and other information. Okay? So another example would be Judges 4:4. In that particular verse, it describes Deborah. No, so there's prior to that, there's a story, and then it takes time to give a description of Deborah, who is the prophetess, wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel, and then the story moves on, and then it pauses again in verse 11 to give you information about Heber. Heber the Kenite, who separated from the Kenites, and he is a descendant of the father-in-law of Moses, no? And he is encamped in this place, so and so. And then, verse 12, it resumes again. Okay? Now, for those of you who know Hebrew, there's actually a way to sense this pause, no? If the in actual scene, no, in actual story, where it's still part of the story, you will see what we call a series of verbs. And these verbs have the verb consecutive. So if the story keeps on going, you will see series of verb consecutive. If that stops, and the sentence will start with a noun, not a verb, no? You have a noun, an adjective. The sentence starts with that. Mostly likely, that's a pause. So there's a grammatical way by which you can determine it. No, in English sometimes it says now there was this, and then it gives you some more details. No, but in Hebrew, when you see a break in the series of verbs, so you have verbs that are usually in sequence. No, it's in sequence because you can see that the verbs are connected in that sequence because of the verb consecutive. Now, if you encounter a sentence which is not in sequence, usually it begins not with a verb. Remember, man, in narratives, usually it begins with a verb. The sentence starts with a verb. Um, if the Hebrew sentence doesn't start with a verb, suspect a pause. Okay, so that's one way to detect it. Okay, now the narrator gives depictions which describes a static situation rather than an event. No, so this is another example of what happens in a pause. It gives you just a description of a situation before it resumes again with the telling of the story. And a very good example here is 1 Samuel 17 verses 3 to 7. No, in verses 3, the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side. So this is the David and Goliath story. So it was the story stops to just give you a description of what's happening in the war, and also to give you a description of Goliath, how high he was, what war implements he had on. He had helmet of bronze, he was armed with coat of mail, and so on and so forth. And then the story resumes in chapter 8. Okay. And here, if you actually look at the Hebrew of it, you can see that break, that thing that I'm talking about, um, in terms of um, in terms of the verb consecutive. Okay. If you need more information about this, those of you who know Hebrew, you let me know. No, I can talk a little bit more about this with you. Now, the last relationship of discourse time and story time is what we would call an ellipsis, or a gap. Okay, and here the discourse time, so it's the opposite of the pause. Here, the discourse time stops while the story time continues. Meaning, the story continues, but you're not given anything. You're not given anything in the story. Nothing is reported in the text. But especially when the story resumes, that something has happened there. Okay? And that's a gap. No, it's a very relevant gap. You know that something is happening because in the resumption of the story, you get clues, no, that something has happened, except that it's not reported. And it's a gap because you have to make sense of that gap. It's not simply just a blank. Okay, it's something that you have to make sense of. So here, time passes but nothing is reported about it. Okay, the narrative does not report events which have transpired in between the episodes. So there's empty spaces between the scenes and summaries, but it's a very relevant, something relevant has happened. Okay, and we've talked about gap versus blanks already. A gap is a lack of information about the world, an event, motive, causal link, character, trait, plot structure, contrived by a temporal displacement. That's a description of Sternberg, in his book on narrative criticism. And gaps involve information that are omitted for the sake of interest. No, it's also to heighten interest, to create suspense, and to make the story more impactful. Okay, versus blanks, where information are omitted because they're not important. No, they're not significant to the storyline. Okay. Now, the problem is no formal, as we have already noted before, there is no formal discourse marker to distinguish between the two. And you will have to rely on, if there's a gap, one of the ways by which you can assess whether it's a gap or a blank is to look at what happens later on, when the story resumes. And this is a very good example of this would be that gap in the Absalom story after it was reported to him that his sister has been raped. Now you get a gap there. Okay, there's nothing that you so the s- the story continues, but in the discourse you're given nothing is there. But when it resumes, no, you know that Absalom has been plotting all along, and actually he's already ready to kill his brother. Okay, and not just kill his brother, but to actually cause the downfall of David. No, he's not just plotting about the brother, but plotting about his father as well. So you're not given anything in discourse, but the story, given what happens next, most likely continued. No, even if there's no information that is given there. Okay, so I will have to stop here, and then this will be the basis of your this one plus the point of view analysis will be the basis of your asynchronous activity. I will have to ask Mom Ruth to upload the lecture, the Zoom link last time when we met together, so that for those of you who want to review, the lecture on point of view, you can review that. At the same time, there's another video that I am posting, which I made earlier, which has something to do with point of view as well. Okay, so I hope you enjoy your activity together, and I'll see you the week after. Next week actually. Okay, blessings to all of you.